Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. Just myself with you tonight, so there'll be lots of opportunity to interact with your comments throughout the evening, hopefully. And this evening, I'm going to spend the time speaking about immigration. It's something that we're asked about quite often at the Family Party. We've got our policies on it. But I've been writing a bit on the topic, some of which will be published in the course of the next week or so, I would guess. But there are quite a few points I thought might be quite interesting to talk through on the live stream. So welcome to the immigration special. Before I start off on that, though, just a reminder that I'll be traveling north over the next few days with Neil Deaton Ryan. We're going to Orkney. We've got a meeting on Stronsay, which we're very much looking forward to. Quite a remote island, part of the Orkney Isles. And we're also having a meeting in Kirkwall, and we're having a meeting in Thurso as well. So we're in the far, far, far north. If anyone's watching from Shetland, well, we'd love to get there as well, even further north. But yeah, for the time being, this is as far north as we're managing. So very much looking forward to those meetings. Check our social media for the details. It would be great to see you if you're anywhere near those places. So immigration. Where do we start? Where do we start? Well, I've heard someone say, well, asking people, do you think immigration is a good thing? It's a bit like saying to someone, do you think food is a good thing? Well, the answer is probably should be, well, it depends what sort and what quantity. Okay, it can go wrong in some ways with too much or the wrong source, and it can also be a healthy thing in various ways. Where the line is drawn, well, that's quite a tricky question. But the things I'm going to go through this evening, there are lots of different points, and I suppose the important question is deciding how much weight to put on each of them. And maybe some of these points you might think, well, they're not really very important, or there's something you might think, well, that's a really important point. But in thinking about immigration, all these points, they're definitely relevant points, and we need to be aware of them in order to come to conclusions. So I'm not going to talk about particularly how to weigh them up or decide which ones are the most important. I'm just going to present them. I think just in general, a positive thing about immigration, I think partly immigrants into Great Britain, in many cases, bring positive values to the nation that are somewhat decayed in Scotland, for example. For example, hard work. A lot of immigrants have got a culture of working hard in terms of employment and business, also working hard in terms of education as well. And that is very welcome indeed. I think lots of immigrants as well contribute in other ways to society, to the economy, various things like that. They're very good citizens. And also, of course, refugees. That's a very unfortunate state some people do end up in. So taking a fair share of refugees, and there'll be very few people that would disagree with that. We can talk about maybe the definition of a refugee a little bit later. Right, when this issue is talked about, often it starts off with the economy. What does it do to the economy? What does immigration do for wages? And the general conclusion on that from economists is not much. It doesn't have a huge impact on the economy, plus or minus. Some people might think a bit positive, some people might think a bit negative in terms of wages. What does it do to wages? Does it increase them? Does it suppress wages? Again, overall, little effect. If there is an effect on wages, it will tend to have a negative effect on the lowest paid in the existing population, but it's not a huge effect there. Whereas in a lot of debate, that tends to be the thing that's front and center in it. But the question with immigration, some of it comes down to this. So if you're making, you've got some sort of factory, you're making something, you've roughly got sort of two options. One option is to say, we could make these things cheaper, or we could have our call center cheap, whatever. If we put it in a poorer country, basically, you don't have to pay people as much. So that would save us money, and that's what we could do. So the advantage of that, well, the disadvantage of that is those jobs that they're not going to be in, say, Scotland. They're going to be in a different country instead. So that's one type of solution. The other type of solution is to say, right, I want a factory. I want cheap labor. The best way to get that cheap labor is to import the workers here. So you'd lobby the government and say, we want more immigration. We want to bring in people with these particular skills. Could we think that will be cheaper for us? That will make it cheaper for us to operate our business here. Okay. I mean, the extreme, a sort of silly example, I suppose, trivial example. You think about that, the au pair culture. A lot of wealthy families employ an immigrant to look after their children. Now, that's something you can't send your children to another country to be looked after by someone at low wages. So someone in that position, that family, like the idea you can bring someone to Scotland who can be paid low wages that will do the job here. So that's the sort of balance. Do you put the job in a different country? So does the job move or does the person move? That's a decision I think all governments have to face. Now, of course, if you import the workers to Scotland or to Britain, then the issue there is going to be, obviously, they'll do the work, but also they might need housing, their children need educating, they're going to be paying for their healthcare, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot of hidden costs. So even if, as far as the employer is concerned, there's a positive effect, the employer's getting the workers they need at the price they want with the training that they want. So it's great for the business, but then there'll be other costs which will be borne by the taxpayer. The taxpayer, including, of course, the immigrant working. I mean, they'll hopefully be paying their fair share as well. But these are the things that need balancing up. Now, this is particularly important in the UK at the moment because we've got a bit of a labour famine in that, particularly since the pandemic, people in Britain, in general, on average, are increasingly not very keen on work. They quite like to do other things instead. Which, if you look at individual choices, you might think, that's fine if someone wants to take a year off working or work part-time, etc. But the general trend is towards people working less. And the effect of that on the economy is that there's a shortage of workers. So, one solution to that would be to encourage people to work more, to incentivize them to work more. But another solution to that could be to import workers as well. Yeah, that's another factor as well. Yeah, that's a good point. Kirsty, there are issues as well. That there are some jobs in Britain that it's very hard to get natives, if you like, to do them because the pay's not great. Maybe it's really hard work. The hours are difficult. So people would rather not do them and either remain on benefits or just manage on less money so they don't bother doing the work. Okay. Right, another issue with immigration, very obvious, straightforward issue, is space in your country, housing in particular, and your services, your health service, or other public services that are offered. Because if you increase the population dramatically, the population of Britain's gone up very dramatically. Scotland, not so much, but it has gone up. And the main factor in that is immigration. Then there are going to be issues there in terms of cost of housing and provision of services. Obviously, the immigrants will be contributing to the taxes in some ways as well, but these things need weighing up. Now, in terms of immigration restrictions, in sub-Saharan Africa, people have done surveys, and they've asked people who live in sub-Saharan Africa, would you like to emigrate to a wealthy country, such as the UK or Scotland? If you could, would you like to do that? 38% of people in sub-Saharan Africa say yes. If they could, they would. They would emigrate to a country like Britain. So that's a total of 456 million people just in sub-Saharan Africa. There's the rest of Africa, there's South America, there's lots of other places as well. But just in sub-Saharan Africa, that's the number of people who would like to emigrate to Europe or America or other wealthy countries. Now, looking at those numbers, 456 million people. That's getting towards the total population of Europe. That's a lot of people. So if countries didn't have an immigration system, if they just said, free for all, open borders, if you want to come and live here, that's just lovely, on you come, then we would find immigration would be in tens of millions into Britain. And I think anyone can see that that's not possible. That's practically impossible. It just couldn't be done, sustaining anything like the systems that we have in place at the moment. Yeah, we've got some good points coming here, but I'll come on to some of those later. Now, with immigration as well, I think a lot of people commit the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition is a formal, logical fallacy, and it involves looking at one case and thinking, well, an example of the fallacy of composition would be look at one case and say, well, that's not doing any harm. Therefore, it would be fine to have any number of them. So it'd be like saying, one raindrop doesn't do any harm at all. Why would anyone worry about any raindrop? One raindrop? One raindrop does no harm whatsoever, so don't worry. Doesn't matter how many raindrops we have, it's all going to be fine. Now, see the error, obviously. The fact that a single case might be okay doesn't mean that an unlimited number might not produce problems that you can't envisage from a single case. So I think some people come to this issue thinking about the nice immigrants that they know, and I'm sure we all do. Okay, lots of people who've come to Scotland, either in this generation or the parents came, whatever you think, they're great people, there's no problem with them whatsoever, and then come to the conclusion that therefore any number of immigrants of any type must be fine, and that is the fallacy of composition. Now, we hear quite a bit about asylum seekers with regard to immigration as well. Obviously, the idea of asylum seeker is someone who wants to be classed as a refugee, but to be a refugee, you have to meet certain criteria. In other words, it's not possible for you to stay in your home country without facing unreasonable risk or persecution or discrimination or whatever. So an asylum seeker is someone who wants to be classed as a refugee, and they come along normally with a story that, in many cases, if it were true, would make them classed as a refugee. Now, unfortunately, in many cases, asylum seekers come and they tell stories which are not true, because they're not really asylum seekers. They're illegal immigrants. They want to get into the country to live here. They know if they apply through the proper channels, they won't get in. So instead of doing that, well, you've got two options. You either try and sneak in, come across on a small boat and try and melt away in, or alternatively, apply for asylum and see if you can get in this way. Now, quite a few asylum seekers, they destroy their documents before they go into the assessment center, and then they've often been coached with a story to tell. So they'll say which country they're from and what's happened to them in order to get asylum. Now, of course, there are genuine asylum seekers as well, obviously, but often the discussion about this operates on the assumption that every asylum seeker is a refugee, whereas a substantial number of them are not. They are chancers, as they might be called in Scotland. Now, if you think about it, a lot of people, if they come from a poor country and move to Scotland, their wage might multiply by 5 or even 10. Okay, so you can possibly multiply your wage by 10. Okay, now if you imagine in Scotland there was a system where if you could persuade some official that your story was true, then your salary multiplied by 10. Then how many people in Scotland would try it on, tell a pack of lies to see if they could get their salary multiplied by 10? An awful lot. Now, the reason I'm saying that is that I'm not saying there's something particularly sort of immoral about asylum seekers or people from other countries. It's just human nature. If you dangle a carrot of 10-fold salary increase in front of people, then people can get quite creative with the stories that they tell. And it's very difficult then to have a system that tries to make sense of these stories to see if they're true or not. Often there's no documentation. I mean, so where do you start? It's a very difficult problem indeed. Now, what happens with quite a few immigrants who come here, you see it's often young men will come to the south of England in particular. What generally happens there is the family in a poor country, they'll sit down and they'll say, right, we've got a bit of money. So they'll be quite wealthy within their own country. We've got a bit of money. What's the best investment we can make with this money? And they'll look at the different options. And for many people around the world, the best investment, the best return on their money, let's say they've got £1,000, say, or £2,000, could be to pay to try and get their 18-year-old son, 20-year-old son or whatever, to try and get him to London. Maybe cross the channel in a small boat. It's totally illegal. They know that. But to get him to London, once he's in London, he can work. Doesn't matter what he does. Could work washing cars or whatever. But the money he gets for that would just be a fortune in the local currency. So this is a really sound financial investment for them. So spend the money on trying to send son abroad to make what to them is a huge amount of money, and he will send quite a bit of it back in remittances. Then after a while, he'll come back himself. And that might have built a row of houses for the whole family to live in. That's the sort of impact it can have. So in many cases, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with families making what's the best investment for them, but they make that decision knowing that what they're doing is illegal. To try and enter a country without permission like that, they know it's illegal. If they thought they could get in through the proper channels, then they would do that. But they bypass that. Okay. That's interesting. Now, there is a citizenship test in the UK, of course. Citizenships also cost quite a bit of money, but there is a test. People have different values. Women value differently. Just from Italy recently. Indeed, people do come with very, very different values. I'm going to talk about that later on. There's lots of examples of that. The Scottish dream, indeed. Yeah, making money, absolutely. And yeah, its chances a specifically Scottish word. Am I right in that? I don't remember hearing it before I came to Scotland, but it's a very useful one in some of these cases here. Right, next. Now, this is my little parable, if you like, to illustrate the way immigration works. Now, I'm telling this as a very simple story, but this account is based on work by economists with all their statistics and graphs and whatever. But this is a fact. This is what I'm going to tell you. This is the way it works. So if you imagine you've got a tiny town in Scotland, and let's say, I don't know, 50 years ago, an Indian couple arrived. They decided to migrate to Scotland. So they set up in this town. Let's go for every stereotype going. So let's say they opened an Indian restaurant. Okay, and they took the kids as well, a couple of kids. So when they moved in there, the locals thought it was quite a novelty, but that was nice. And they had this Indian restaurant, and they really liked the food, so that brightened the place up. So a bit of variety, a bit more diversity in the restaurants. And the kids went to the local school, and they got to know the local kids. That their English became really good because they're mixing in with everyone. And that was fine. The school did a special project on India, and the kids told them about things about India. Everyone was happy. Everything was just fantastic. But then the man's brother and his wife, they heard all about it. They thought, oh, that sounds good. Let's go over as well. We'll go over. So they moved over with their couple of kids as well. And they got the house next door to the other ones. And they worked in the restaurant as well, which was really doing well. But what tended to happen now, there's a slight change in that the kids started playing with each other. That the Indian kids started playing with each other a little bit more. So the new ones, they spoke in their Hindi or whatever. So the language didn't get quite as good. And the adults as well, they started speaking in Hindi as well, a bit more on their own. So their English didn't get better at quite the same rate. But anyway, it was all fine. And then other relatives heard about it. And as more relatives came over, eventually the message started being, look, you could come over. We've got, there's loads of us here. We all speak Hindi, so you don't need to bother learning English. I mean, it's just great. So then you get people who haven't thought, I'm prepared to take the step to move into an alien culture, and it's going to be difficult, but I'm really going to have to make the effort to fit in. You're now getting people who are thinking, I could move there and I can just stay among my own. I'm not going to need to learn the language. I can just be with people from my culture, and I'm willing to do that. So as more and more people, as this community grows and grows, more and more people are likely to think, yeah, I'll go for that. That would suit me. That would suit me. And then say immigration accelerates, more and more people come. And then you have the situation where you've got an isolated community, linguistically isolated, maybe in terms of values. They're just socially as well. They'll tend to be a bit cut off from the rest of the town. And then that's the situation where problems can start to emerge. The problems might be the fault of the isolated community. The problems might be the fault of the natives around them. I mean, it doesn't matter where they come from, and probably a bit of both maybe. But the fact is that there tend to be tensions and problems that emerge in that situation. So the upshot of that, I think there are dangers of allowing large concentrated communities of immigrants to cluster. It doesn't matter allow it. Just that's something that can create problems. So if they assimilate, spread out, mix in different areas, etc., that tends to be more positive. Right. So let's go back to immigration. So if someone applies to come here legally, and the UK government says no, is it okay to do that? Is it somehow immoral to refuse someone entry? I would suggest not at all. There's how many countries are there in the world? 200 odd. Lots of countries to apply to. Now, a refugee, now I think that there's a moral imperative to take a fair share of refugees. But if someone just wants to move to another country for economic reasons or whatever, I don't feel there's any responsibility whatsoever for another country to let them in. Basically, it's entirely up to that country to make that decision on the basis of its own interests and the will of the residents. Now, when it comes to refugees, there's a substantial body of opinion that says the best thing for refugees is to be housed near to the conflict zone, disaster zone, whatever, to be housed near there, allow them to work, maybe even allow them to continue their business that existed where they used to be. So keep that community close to where they used to be. And then as soon as the crisis has passed, the people can move back, and that helps reconstruct and bring the society back to life, and it can progress on from there. Now, if you imagine you take people, let's say there's a war in a country, you take people from that area and you scatter them around the whole world. Okay, when the war's over, what's the probability that they're actually going to go back again and be able to resurrect the society, the civil society, the economy that was there? It's probably less likely. So there are some serious thinkers in this area who think keeping refugees closer to the source is a much healthier thing. From their point of view as well, there's less cultural dislocation if you're near to where you originally came from. The country next door is probably less different than going to a totally alien country there. So that is quite important. Now, the thing with refugees as well, if there's a crisis and people become genuinely scared, so there are genuine refugees, which ones are likely to make it to the UK? And the answer is the ones with most money. The ones who are going to afford a plane ticket or some sort of transit, then they're the ones who will arrive here. The most needy people, the elderly, poor, maybe people with young children, quite often they're the ones who are left behind because they can't afford to travel away as more wealthy people can. So in taking refugees, I think the onus is on rich people, not just to prioritize the people who turn up, but it's to have an intelligent system that assesses the need and acts on that need. I think that's a moral way to deal with that. Right. So, Ian, massive difference between immigrants and refugees. When talked about in the mainstream media, they're bundled together. Absolutely spot on. Yep, absolutely. And they also talk about asylum seekers, assuming that they're asylum seekers. Now, that's a bit of a grey area, isn't it? If you say someone's an asylum seeker, that description, it assumes that they're telling the truth, doesn't it? Well, no, it doesn't actually. I'll correct myself. They are seeking asylum. That's definitely the case. But the question is whether or not they're seeking asylum because they have a genuine case, or whether they're seeking asylum because actually they've got a pack of lies that they think is going to do the trick and is going to get them into the country and give them a good deal. So, yeah, absolutely correct. Asylum seekers coming from France, Spain, Germany. Yep, they shouldn't be arriving here because you're supposed to seek asylum in the first safe country you arrive at. So even an asylum seeker turning up in Britain, virtually definitely they haven't followed the proper procedure, which is obviously not right. That shouldn't be happening. Right, moving on. Where are we on to? Right, the next thing. I think a lot of people underestimate the challenges of migration particularly to move to a totally different culture. I think the sense of cultural dislocation is often underestimated. Also, often when people migrate, they they strain or lengthen a lot of links to family as well. And I think that leads to a lot of problems that maybe they don't foresee. So maybe a lot of immigrants and emigrants, people who leave Britain to other countries as well, the lure is the money. Okay, you're going to be a lot wealthier. And the downsides are maybe not given sufficient weight in a lot of cases. So I believe personally, a lot of people make a choice to migrate into Britain and out of Britain, and they end up it actually wasn't the right thing for them to do. I came across when I was working in as an employee, I came across quite a few people who had moved to, was it the school, who'd moved to the school to work, and other people as well. And you were couples who moved to Scotland for the work from other countries. And often the man would be working and the mum might have kids, young kids. So the mum was at home a lot of the time. Quite often the man would be having a great time, but mum was at home depressed because she didn't know anyone, didn't have a normal network of support. Yeah, I think that's quite a high price to pay for the sake of, a bit of novelty, going to a new country, earning a little bit more money. Okay. I mentioned already, when it comes to refugees, the refugees who tend to turn up first are the rich ones. They're the ones who can afford the plane ticket or can afford the transport to get moving. So if you just take the first refugees, even when, asylum seekers, whatever, what you're tending to do is take the wealthiest people from poorer nations. Same with immigration in general. If you just take people who apply, the people who can afford to apply and travel are generally the wealthier people. So if you have an immigration system that just picks from people applying, you're increasing global inequality. You're increasing global inequality. Now, being pro-immigration is generally seen as a left-wing virtue, but it increases global inequality because in a poor country, you take out the richer people, move them to a rich country where they become even richer, and the gap between the rich countries and the poor countries becomes bigger. Because the rich country probably hasn't made that much difference to them, but the poor countries become poorer because its wealthiest, most productive people have been taken. So I think that's a genuine moral issue to think about with immigration. And the other thing a bit related to that is the brain drain issue as well. I mean, the classic case is medical staff. Because some poor countries, they train their doctors and nurses using significant proportion of their scarce resources. I mean, training doctors and nurses is a very expensive business. But imagine if you're a good, responsible leader, so you train doctors, but then half of them leave and go and earn 10 times as much in America or the UK. Then that's a pretty difficult situation for your nation, isn't it? I mean, what are you going to do about that? You might try and have laws to stop people leaving. But actually, in terms of human rights, you can't restrict someone from leaving their own country. So if you're a poor country training doctors, you can't actually stop your doctors from leaving the country. You could try and impose some sort of financial penalty, but very difficult once they have left the country. So then that's an ethical issue about rich countries stealing. That's a very emotive term, but you know what I mean. Poaching, shall we say? Or let's not even use that. Just employing, taking medical staff from poor countries. I think there's very significant issues there. Another one as well. Let's imagine, even in Scotland, let's say you've trained as a doctor in Scotland, and then you think, all right, there's more money being a plastic surgeon in America, so I'm going to go there and earn twice as much money. Now, again, people are free to do that. But on the other hand, that doctor should think, right, who paid, £500,000 for my training? It was the taxpayers of Scotland. Right. So what right have I to then go and use that training to make a personal fortune in America? I think that's a real question. That's a real question. And I think it needs sitting. I'm not saying there should be any rules in place to stop the doctor doing that, but I think it's a question that we need to face. Someone trained as a doctor in Scotland, so the Scottish taxpayer spent his £500,000 on them. Then they chose to go and be a doctor in a poor country, a sort of aid worker, missionary, medical missionary, whatever. Now, personally, I think that's a very noble thing to do, and I very much hope people would go and do that. So I wouldn't want the government to discourage that at all. But that's the opposite of taking a doctor from a poor country and bringing them to Scotland. So significant issues to talk about there. I've talked about doctors in particular, but it applies to a lot of other areas as well. It could be a really serious problem for some poorer countries. But a few years ago, I think it was 12 African nations signed a joint letter to the UK government saying, basically, please stop taking our health professionals. And the UK government just said, no, we're going to carry on just as we are. SNP new taxation policy will be forcing a lot of the most skilled people to move. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say forcing, but yeah, I mean, the net effect will be a migration of highly paid jobs. Also, I think the way that will manifest most clearly would be cases where a company is deciding where to set up some sort of new operation. So if you've got an operation with very highly paid staff, there's going to be a disincentive for setting that up in Scotland rather than in England. I mean, this is the sort of thing that Kate Forbes has been pointed out. I mean, it just shows the state of Scotland. I mean, Kate Forbes states some of these things. And what she says is often, it's fairly obvious, basic stuff, but it's like revolutionary in Scotland. People are just like, wow, what's someone saying here? Right, dangerous refugees. We'll come on to that later. Right, repatriation. Once someone's a citizen, I think you can't repatriate them. You've got to treat them like everyone else. At other stages of the process, then I think the state should have control as it wishes on that. People without integrity will only suit themselves. Yes. Yeah, I agree. Right, let's move on. What are we on to now? Right, go back to employers. I think the temptation for employers is to think, right, we need people with a certain set of skills. In the olden days, they might have said, okay, we need to set up our training scheme. Let's get apprentices. Let's cooperate with the local colleges, local school. We've got to get people trained up to do the job. Whereas an alternative now might be, let's give them work permits. Let's start advertising these jobs in India. There's lots of people there who can program in this language or whatever. Let's just import the workers. Now, the big problem with that, of course, is it's removing training opportunities for natives. And I think that's very important. So again, this is a place where the interests of business and the interests of the nation don't coincide. I think often the interests of business and the interests of the nation do coincide, probably in the majority of cases. It's good for the nation if businesses are flourishing. But I think in this particular area, they don't necessarily coincide. Okay. Right, next point, multiculturalism. There's a slippery term. When I talk about multiculturalism, I'm talking about the genuine sort of academic definition of it. And that's the idea that within a society, you can have different cultures living in sort of semi-isolated communities, if you like. So the different cultures don't merge together. New people don't assimilate, but people can maintain their own culture within the wider nation. And I mentioned that earlier on. I think there's problems associated with that. I mean, one problem is inequality. I mean, let's say, for example, I think in Scotland, there's a lot of immigrants in Scotland, but nowhere near as many as there are in parts of England, for example. But let's say in Glasgow, there came to exist a large portion of Glasgow that was basically all Muslims, and they all spoke a particular Arabic, I don't know, whatever. They all spoke the same language. In any case, it became an isolated Muslim community. Now, one of the problems with that is inequality. Again, left-wingers tend to be very keen on multiculturalism, but it leads to inequality. I mean, can the opportunities for people living within that sub-community be equal to those engaging with the mainstream? I think the answer is no. It's going to limit the opportunities for people within that community, which is going to lead to inequalities. Now, when the Scottish government comes across inequalities like that, they think, right, what can we do about it? We need to tackle racism, and we need to make it so people can live in their own communities like that, because that's just fine. That's multiculturalism. That's what we're all about. But that is inevitably a route to inequality. So I think assimilation and integration are very important from that point of view. Tensions just tend to emerge when you've got two groups of people that don't communicate with each other very much. Tensions and hostilities tend to emerge. That's just human nature. Now, some people might say, oh, we can be extra nice. We can hold hands and have lots of positive things said about each other. We can overcome human nature. Now, I wish that were true, but I don't think it is. If you look around the world, global conflicts, I mean, what are they? It's almost always it's conflict between two people who see themselves having a different identity, two groups of people who see themselves as having a different identity. So it's bringing that potential conflict line within a nation. I think stereotypes build up. So if there's a group of people, let's imagine there's a large section of people of a certain nationality in Edinburgh, and I couldn't speak their language, so I didn't interact with them at all. All I did was heard stories about them and saw them around the place. Then it's easier for stereotypes to build up. If I hear a bad news story about someone from that group, the temptation, it might not be logical, but the temptation or the error could be to think, oh, that just shows what that bunch are like. So this can build up in people's minds, and again, it can lead to problems. And you end up with a situation where, you know, someone from community X murders someone from community Y, then the people in community Y are up in arms, and they're saying, right, we're not going to have this. We're not having this by community X, so we're going to do something like this. You know, let's have a spot of rioting. Let's go and beat someone up from that community. And then it's the classic feud situation where people in each community, what they know is a list of things people from the other did to them. You know, they forget about things they did to the other side, but this is what they've done to us over the years. And the feud builds up and can boil over. But going back to that academic research has shown that the more diverse a culture in terms of national backgrounds, the lower the level of trust. So if you bring more immigrants into an area, then in the short term, at least, the level of trust between people goes down. Now, you may say again, that's a really unfortunate aspect of human nature, and I agree entirely, and I would do my utmost to resist it. But the fact is, the substantial number of people won't resist that, and the level of trust goes down. So the important things in relation to these then are assimilation and integration to the point of shared identity. I think ideally, immigrants to the country, you shouldn't have to think of them as a different sort of person. They're just another citizen. They're another Scot, another UK citizen. You shouldn't have to think of them as being a different type of person. Now, the SNP, for example, and, well, mainstream politics, their line is they encourage people to see themselves as being a different type of person because they think they can butter them up and win some votes that way. But I would like a society where people are not treated as fundamentally different from each other. Yeah, Bobby. Yeah, social capital. Yeah, that's exactly the term that's used for it in many concepts. Yeah, the lower level of trust. Culture clash. We'll come on to that in a little while. Culture will come with them. That's exactly the issue I'm going to talk about next. Now, culture comes with people. I've talked about that already. In some cases, that culture is you work hard, do as well as you can, get the best job you can, and look after your family. And we can import as much of that culture as we like, because that's absolutely great. And also, in terms of moral values as well, a lot of immigrants are quite conservative in their social values. You know, great. You know, more the merrier, more the merrier. We need reinforcements on that front. But it's also possible to import problems through immigration as well. I mean, think about the United States. They took a lot of Italian immigrants, and through that, they imported the mafia into the United States of America. Now, I think that's quite an interesting thought. That you don't hear that articulated very often, do you? But it's true. So should have America have said, oh, we're not taking Italians because we're just going to end up with some mafia, or we're going to try and check them. I mean, how do you check? You know, put a thing on the form to tick. Are you involved in the mafia or, you know, in a gang activity? Well, obviously that's not going to work. But still, it's a factor to be considered. I mean, I think in America, would they look back and wish they'd never allowed any Italians in? I'm sure they wouldn't. I'm sure, because it was a very small proportion that were involved in that. But I'm just pointing out the fact that they did import a problem from Italy, which was mafia, gang violence, Islamic terrorism. I look at France, for example. Simple fact, immigration into France imported a problem of Islamic extremism. I mean, there's just stating a simple fact, is this? And I've heard it argued that in the UK, gun culture, criminals using guns, was imported through immigration. as well, that there used to be a culture in Britain where the police were not armed and criminals didn't use guns either. If a criminal used a gun, they would be absolutely shunned by their fellow criminals, to the point of almost being handed over to the police, because it was just not cricket to use a gun. And for, I don't know, maybe a century even, this culture, and how valuable is that culture? To have a national culture, the criminals just do not use guns, so the police don't use guns either. That is immensely valuable. But apparently some Caribbean immigrants came over, and the culture of using guns in crime among them was quite strong. And so they brought that to Britain, and that's when gun crime commenced. Now, I've heard that story. I mean, maybe there's a bit more to it than that. Probably, again, with lots of these things, the vast majority of people coming from the Caribbean were not like gun-toting criminals, but enough of them were to have a very significant effect on UK culture. Now, of course, there's plenty of examples of really negative things that emerge within native culture, isn't there? I mean, we've got no problem coming up with problems all on our very own, but still, if there's a possibility of importing them, that needs to be borne in mind as well. Right, next point. Values. Someone mentioned this earlier on, different values. I went down to, it's Birmingham. I was in Birmingham years ago doing a debate with some Muslims. And after it, we went for a curry, which Muslims often do. So it's normally just the men. You go out for a curry, and it was very nice. We're having a great chat. And I was talking to someone, I think it was a lecturer in a college, further education college, very pleasant, so well-educated man, I would say. And I said to him, so what's your take on democracy? And he said, democracy, great, all for it, but democracy should be under a sort of religious leader. So you have elections and elect the government. The government sort of run the country, but then above the government is the sort of Ayatollah type figure, the religious appointee who basically can keep the government in check. So he's got the final say over everything. I thought, wow, okay, that's an interesting position, isn't it? So is that democratic? Well, not really. Not really. Now, the problem with that is you would hope within a democratic nation, when there's a dispute, when there's differences in values, the way you'd hope to solve them would be by the democratic process. Okay, people stand for election, put forward different points of views. The population has its say. I know the system doesn't work well in some ways, but that's roughly the way it's supposed to happen. But if you've got people coming into that saying, well, we don't like the democratic system, we think there should be a supreme Muslim authority over the parliament, then that's quite difficult, isn't it? So if he enters politics, putting forward that viewpoint, trying to get elected, then that's the sort of thing that doesn't get resolved through the democratic process. That's the sort of thing that heads more towards, civil wars than democratic revolution. Now, I'm sure most Muslims don't believe anything like that at all, but this particular gentleman did. And that's an example of a value that's going to create problems within a democratic state, because it can't be reconciled. The different point of views can't be reconciled within a democratic process. I mean, other sort of values as well. If you have someone coming into the country that doesn't accept the rule of law, doesn't accept the authority of the police, maybe doesn't even accept the nation's right to exist, then I think they're very, very significant problems that can develop in the longer term. Okay, let's keep going. Right, an important thing with nation states and democracy is the idea that we have self-determination. So the people of Scotland, to some degree, people of the UK, we make our own decisions. We've got a democratic system, and we make our own decisions, self-determination. But the question you have to ask there is, who or what is the self, or the self? Who comprise the self? Now, normally, the answer is pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's the people who live in the nation. It's the citizens of the nation. But then things get a bit more complicated, don't they? Because then can the government decide to change who the self is? Because over the last however many years, the population of the UK has gone up by about 10 million because of government policies. The government's basically said, we're changing to a significant degree who the self are that are going to exercise self-determination in the UK. Now, if they're going to do that, then they've got to be very explicit with the existing self. They've got to say to them, right? What we're intending to do is supplement you with another 10 million people, and then that's going to become the new self, and that's the self that's going to make the decisions going forward. That needs to be very explicitly agreed by the electorate, and I think over recent decades it very much hasn't been. Parties have not been open about the immigration policies that they're intending to implement through the course of their term in government. Another relevant issue, the NHS, pensions, etc. We have a sort of social contract in Britain. The idea is that you pay in at various points, and then you're going to benefit from the system at points in your life. So NHS might be any time, but particularly as you're getting older, you might need more NHS resources devoted to you, and then you'll draw your pension, etc. And that scheme is very finely balanced. Well, actually, as I say that, it's not finely balanced. I mean, it's heading to disaster because the birth rate's too low. But that's a different question. But ideally, it's very finely balanced. But then when someone comes and joins the scheme partway through, then, well, we would have to ask questions, don't we? So if someone moves to the country like age 60, I would say it's quite apparent that in terms of our like social contract, that they're sort of getting in, that there's sort of freeloading. They're going to get a lot of benefits from it without having paid into it through the rest of their lives, without having contributed to it. Now, I'm not suggesting what the solution to that is, but it's something that does need to be borne in mind, because what will tend to happen is if the population in general sees people playing the system, what do they tend to do? They start to resent paying into the system themselves, and that's when the whole system starts to creak. So if you want a sort of left-wing social welfare type society, then to maintain that, it's important that the people paying in are feeling that, they're getting their money's worth, are feeling that they're contributing to a system that's fair. If they don't think it's fair, they're more likely to say, I don't want to pay it. I'm voting for the party that's going to cut taxes and forget all the benefits. We don't want universal health care. We don't want all these benefits. Let's forget the state pension, every man for himself. I'd rather keep my money and look after myself. That's what people tend to think more if they think other people are getting an unfair advantage in the system. Right, we've heard a bit about values and culture. Common culture, I think, is vital for a nation, so people can relate to each other. You can engage in conversation with people and have some common ground and feel a sense of loyalty and identity. I mean, the classic test case of this is, a crisis. So let's say there was some appalling earthquake in Scotland. I don't know, it was something really on a monumental scale. How many people would think, oh, right, this is not so good, I'm off. I'm going to go and just live in another country. Scotland's not great at the moment. And how many would think, right, this is a terrible thing has happened to my country. I need to stay here to get this sorted out, to help people, to get us back on our feet again. That's what I need to do. Now, if you've got a substantial portion of your population who are of the, all right, Scotland's not so great anymore, I'm going to move somewhere else, then that's a bit of a risk. War is the ultimate example of this. So if it came to war, how many people in the UK, for example, would say, all right, I'll just move, or there's no way I'm fighting with this country? And how many people would think, this is something worth fighting for, something worth defending? So yes, I'm willing to play my part in that. So I think they're very relevant considerations. I mean, in terms of culture and values, I think every society uses its education system to pass on its culture and values to each generation. Ideally, that's what they're trying to do. And the nation in general tries to socialize its young people into the culture of the nation so they can feel part of it, relate to people, etc. So if that's a really important part of what a nation does through its education system, through the bringing up of children, then if people are going to join the nation who haven't been through that process, then that's going to make a significant difference to that process. So I'm sure anyone, let's say someone from the Scottish government, is Scottish education important in terms of giving people roots in Scottish culture and identity? They'd say, yes, of course it is. That's a really important thing he does. You say, well, what about if someone moves to the country and they've missed that education? Therefore, that must be, to some degree, that must be a negative. But they would refuse to admit that. But I think it's simple logic that it's got to be something to wade up. I'm not saying how much weight to put on it, but it just is something that needs to be considered. Next thing to say, I think having bias towards or discrimination in favor of compatriots, people, citizens, etc., is absolutely fine. Same like a family. A family have special responsibility to people within your family. If you reach beyond that, and that's particularly virtuous, and indeed is morally required in a lot of senses, but still the special commitment to members of the family remains. And I think a nation, in a sense, is like, some people call it an imagined community. It operates as though we're a group of people who all know each other. We're all on the same side. We all make sacrifices for each other. We're all in this together. Let's look after each other. That's the culture you want to create in a nation, a bit like within a family. And within that culture, to have a special concern for people who are within the nation, I think is absolutely acceptable. Right. Okay, I'll come to some comments again in a minute. Human rights. We heard lots about human rights in terms of immigration. Most of what people say is nonsense. You have a right under the United Nations Convention to leave the country you're in. Doesn't matter what country you're living in. You've got a right to leave it, I guess, unless you're in prison or whatever. But generally speaking, you can leave the country. You can also re-enter your own country. So if you go on holiday and then the UK government discovers that you've committed some terrible crime or something, you've still got a right to return to your own country. What you don't have a right to do is to enter someone else's country. There's not a human right saying that you can enter any other country that you wish to. It's up to that country to decide about that. Now, it's quite interesting, isn't it? There's a lot of migration within nations that take place. But small countries, you can't move very far without crossing a border. If you think of, say, the United States of America, though, people can move vast different distances without crossing a border. And again, human rights prevent restrictions on movement within a state. So this all went out the window during the pandemic, of course. But generally speaking, you can't have a rule that says, you're not allowed to go and live in a different part of the country. You have to allow that. But within a state, just have a think about that. Think about the Highlands of Scotland. What's happening there now? There's concern about depopulation. People are moving from the Highlands to the Central Belt or to England or whatever. And that's a problem in some regards in the Highlands. So the Scottish government, quite rightly, is looking at that and saying, right, we've got a bit of a problem here. Let's see what we can do about it. Are there any policy changes we can make to try and either encourage people to stay in the Highlands or to mitigate the problems that have been created? Let's see what we can do. What levers can we pull to deal with this developing problem? And that's great. The problem is with migration between countries is no one can put these measures in place. So if you've got a country where there's a huge amount of people leaving and they're all coming to live in Scotland, say, it's not happening at the moment, but let's say that's what's happening. So the country that they're leaving, that's creating huge problems. Maybe they're coming into Scotland, that might be creating some problems as well. Where if it was all part of one country, the government would have various policies to help with that. But because it's between two countries, the government can't take steps to help deal with some of the problems created. So that's quite interesting. I'll just say something about the what would you do if a disaster happened here and you had to, if I had to flee the country? Yeah, I'd become a refugee. I mean, it's quite hard to imagine a situation that would mean we have to flee the United Kingdom. But if it was absolutely necessary, then I would seek asylum and hope to be taken in as a refugee somewhere else. Yeah. Humza's white speech. Yeah. I mean, that's a classic example of like discouraging assimilation. Instead of saying, look, we're all the same. We're not different sorts of people. If you're here, you're with us. That's great. Let's just try and make the country the best country we can. Trying to encourage people to see themselves as victims of discrimination, etc., and to stir up racial tension. That is a major part of Humza Yousaf's political agenda, I would say. Okay, not too long to go, but I haven't got too many points left. This idea of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda has been quite controversial, hasn't it? I was reading something about this. My philosophers are on my wavelength often, and they were saying generally, if within a family there's an elderly person who can't look after themselves, it's considered to be perfectly ethical to say, okay, we're going to outsource the care for this person in a nursing home, for example. That's fine. So that's someone saying, I don't want to do this work myself, so we're going to pay someone else to look after these people. Think about a boarding school. So you've got parents with a child, they say, right, okay, for the next 10 weeks or whatever, I don't want to be looking after this child at home. I want to pay someone else to look after them in a boarding school. And generally that's seen as an okay thing to do. When it comes to asylum seekers, why is it not okay for the government to say, okay, we don't want to look after these people ourselves, we're going to pay someone else to look after them? Now, surely, if within the family you can outsource, you can delegate to other people the care for these people, then surely when you talk about asylum seekers, then delegating that care to someone else or to another country seems perfectly acceptable, I think, connected with that. Right, man, this often happens to me. I make notes and then can't remember what they mean. Expenses, I think immigrants often do impose expenses on culture. I mean, the classic example is translation. So if someone doesn't speak English, that imposes costs on public services. Now, I think investment in providing English lessons is money well spent. That does happen to some degree in Scotland, but more and more of it would be fantastic. I heard of something where someone was calculating the economic contribution of immigrants, and they included in it anti-racism charities and charities that worked with immigrants, as if the immigrants had generated that economic activity, which I thought was pretty far-fetched. Family reunification. Well, that's a tricky one, isn't it? So, I mean, if people get normally, if someone lives in the UK, if they're sitting here and they marry someone else, then that person can come and live in the UK. I think that's quite right. I think if someone moves to the UK, that they're an asylum seeker, say, or an illegal immigrant. But the thing with bringing relatives is often, bringing a husband or wife is one thing. Bringing the extended family, well, that can lead to the situation I was saying earlier on, where the bigger a community you get, the more people want to come and move into it. So that's quite a difficult question. I would say, though, if someone's deciding to move to another country, then they need to make the decision in the light of whether or not they want other family members to join them. So if you're thinking, I want to come and live in Scotland, but I would like 8 relatives to move here as well over the next few years, I would say to that person, okay, do your homework, investigate to see if that will be possible, or maybe apply altogether. But I would maybe have limited sympathy if someone moved and then complained that the rules didn't allow a particular relative to come. I would say that's part of the decision you make when you decide to move to a new country. Right, we're very close to the end. Right. I think I don't know much about the scheme in detail, but I think in general, the principle of outsourcing or delegating responsibility to process asylum seekers, I think, is perfectly acceptable for the reasons I just stated. So I don't have any problems with that. Have I read The Strange Death of Europe? I have. Yes, very interesting it was too. Okay, just to conclude, I mean, generally speaking, people on the left of politics tend to be internationalists. Now, internationalist doesn't mean you like going on holiday to other countries and you sort of like foreigners. That's not what internationalism is. Internationalism is the belief that the nation state is really that's often the source of the problems, and the way forward is supranational bodies, the EU, United Nations. Nations joining together in various ways. Now, the difference between that and imperialism is quite difficult to discern sometimes, but internationalism is generally a thing on the left. Like if you look at the Soviet Union, that's like a sort of left-wing empire, if you like. And to a lot of people, particularly on the extreme left, they look at that and think, that's really what we need to aim for. Whereas people on the right of politics tend to be more positive about the nation state as a community that's self-supporting, has a sort of identity and pride within itself, and that can be very effective in generating wealth and looking after its people and being peaceful and stable, etc. So that's the general difference we have there. So when it comes to immigration, generally people on the left tend to be enthusiastic about it. Part of the reason for that is I think they often feel that national identity is a negative thing. It's national identity that leads to wars between nations. If we could just merge all these countries together, then we could all live in peace and harmony. But as long as we're in separate nations, there's going to be problems, which I disagree with. I don't agree with that. But that's part of the reason why they want to see more immigration, because they want to sort of dilute national identity. Now, if you look at what they say the rest of the time, they use other means as well to dilute national identity by trying to make people embarrassed at the history of their nation, or just to denigrate it at every opportunity. Whereas I think the nation state actually has got a lot of positives. Now, this idea, often their goal is one world government. They think if we could have, international democracy, give more and more power to the United Nations, and eventually that would eliminate wars completely. The problem with that is any system is peopled by people, and there's going to be dangers with that. So at least with nation states, you might get a rogue one every now and again, and that might cause a lot of problems. But imagine if you manage to get one world government, then how about if that goes wrong? What's going to happen about that? Who's going to put that right? Well, that's quite a scary thought, isn't it? I certainly think so. The other thing with international government, I mean, can democracy work like that? Your vote counts for so little, and it's so remote from you. Would you feel you've got any skin in the game in like international democracy? I don't think you would. I think it's entirely unsustainable. But I think people who propose that, I think they then start to say, well, they're not actually that bothered about the democracy side of it. We just got to put the right person in charge, and then everything will be fine. Well, not so sure. I think often people talk about, diversity, enriching the culture. I don't really get that particularly. Now, if you want to experience other cultures, see arts and things from other cultures, it's all around us in any case. People don't necessarily need to live here in order to share in their culture. You hear people as well talking about diversity, saying, "Oh, it's really great to have, for example, some people from Africa, say, in this group." And I tend to think, well, I'm not really bothered about that. It's great to have people. It's great to have people from anywhere. Yeah, because people bring, their own personality, their own abilities, their own perspective, and that's great. Yeah. But the fact that someone's from a different country, to me, that's a very small part of the unique contribution they bring to life or any sort of activity. Now, sometimes it can happen that someone might have a perspective because their background's been very different. They might be different than the perspective of other people. Yeah, that happens. That can be very valuable. But what I'm saying is, I don't find normally that that's a big part of my interactions or relationship with those people. Think about people you work with, or people in different contexts who might have a very different cultural background. How often is that different cultural background what you appreciate about them? And I would guess the answer is not much. The main thing you appreciate them is just, it's another person. I mean, people are just in general, positive. The people that you work with, that you're around, I mean, and generally, they've got their own qualities. And it doesn't matter where they came from. That's what you appreciate about them, mainly. So I've run over very slightly. Let's just have a look at a quick comment here. I would not trust anyone going to be cared for, but rather sold in slavery. Come from Africa, trust is an issue. I'm hopefully wrong. Could be a Southern African issue. All right, this is talking about the Rwanda thing. Anyone? Yeah. In principle, I think the idea of outsourcing the asylum system, I agree with. But obviously, if there's going to be problems associated with that, then that is a problem. The SNP's idea of independence is to be totally controlled by a higher power who controls lots of other countries, not independent at all. Total oxymoron. Yes, agree entirely. The higher power is not God, of course. The higher power, that's used by Alcoholics Anonymous, isn't it? That's their sort of euphemism for God. Not euphemism, anyway, whatever the word is, for God. Yeah, the SNP is a very curious form of nationalism because they don't promote Scottish national identity. They promote what they call Scottish values, but in fact, they're international, progressive, left, liberal, secular values. But they present those as the vision for Scotland. And then they present the vision of being part of international, being under the authority, if you like, of international bodies like the EU. So it's a very curious sort of nationalism. Now, when I first came to Scotland, the Scottish nationalist movement was more conventionally nationalist. They would spend their time complaining about the Duke of Wellington statue on Princes Street, and they'd forever be talking about, Scottish inventors invented all these things. Scottish people are great. Scotland's wonderful. We should be proud of it. So we should be independent. That tended to be, and then that seemed to disappear completely. And it was all, we can be a modern progressive nation with the same values as everyone else in the EU. But I think just recently, just maybe, the old sort is coming back again. See, there's complaints about the Red Coats Cafe in Edinburgh Castle. It's been called the Red Coats Cafe forever. But suddenly some nationalists have decided they don't like the name of it. And they're campaigning against it. So I'm just wondering if Scottish nationalism might become a bit more conventionally nationalistic there. We shall see. Watch this space. Yeah, someone just mentioning the Red Coats Cafe. The last time I went there, I went with my sister, and she had her food. It was cold, and she kept having to have it warmed up, and they still couldn't come up with hot food. But other times I found it very good. So, right, we shall conclude there. Thank you very much for your comments. Thanks for watching. Hopefully that was interesting. I've been doing a bit of work on immigration recently. I've been working on a document which I'll publish before too long, and these were a few thoughts I had up my sleeve. So I've enjoyed your company and your comments this evening. Do join us next week. And if you're in the areas of Kirkwall, Stronsay, or Thurso, we hope to see you over the next couple of days. All right, thanks for watching. Good night.